I'm Rob Trzynski. This is Symposium, where we bring people together to have conversations about the nature of liberalism and a free society. And we're definitely bringing the conversation today because I've got three guests here, four including myself. We're going to be doing this as sort of the grid format. We're going to be bringing people from various viewpoints together to have a discussion about a particular topic. So let's bring everyone in. My guests today are Helen Pluckrose of Counterweight. Hi, Helen.
Hello.
And I've got Kathy Young of, well, what are you not doing, Kathy? It's Arc Digital, and what other credits would you want to have mentioned here?
Oh my goodness, dude. I mean, do you want me to take up the whole show with just my list of credits? I'm mainly it's Arc Digital, Visa, and Newsday. So okay, those are the three regulars.
Yeah, so you've been doing a lot of writing recently and very much all over some of these free speech issues. And then we also have an old friend of mine, Robert Garmong, who is a teacher and philosopher and a contributor to Symposium with an article on John Stuart Mill and the good and bad things he did for the cause of liberalism. So the topic I want to have a conversation about today is this somewhat vague and elusive concept of the culture of free speech. And it's one of those things that I find philosophically interesting because there's clearly something there, that there's a need for a concept of free speech that goes beyond just the political concept or the legal concept of free speech to embrace a cultural norm of openness of discussion. But at the same time, just like what is cancel culture is a big debate, it could be a difficult thing to nail down exactly what that means. So there's something clearly there, but defining it is much more difficult. And that's the topic I wanted to bring up today. And I want to start with Helen, because there's something you said recently in another forum about how, so you run an organization called Counterweight that's there to help people who are in danger of being canceled or in some way forced to say things that they don't want to say, who are victims of this sort of oppressive anti-free speech culture. But you were saying the other day that a lot of the cases you deal with are not, there's no legal aspect to them. It's not that anybody's violating somebody's legal rights. They don't have a case they can take into court. It's more a matter of a cultural pressure to conform. So if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the cases, people who come to us, they are in danger of being fired. Most of our people are employees, and obviously, the whole sort of legal aspect isn't actually something we can do a great deal with internationally or whatever. So we do deal with culture issues, with negotiation, with giving people moral support, community on a greater level, and sort of practical advice and educational resources. But yeah, this is essentially the problem at its roots, where laws and things differ, and they're also very difficult in practice to narrow down, where and how do we balance, say, the employer's right to hold their own political views in their own spaces and the employer's right not to keep someone who's damaging their business. It's very messy, but as a culture, yes, we need to try to get back to this idea where people can have radically different ideas and still actually talk to each other, be friends with each other, that if different groups have different ideas, they can coexist while having them without killing, persecuting, firing, or discriminating against each other. That's a cultural thing that's really, I think, counterintuitive, and that we need to focus on.
Now, you talked though about killing, persecuting, and then firing, and the sort of social disapproval. And these are clearly, there's the whole different gradation there between the two kinds of things. There's a difference between I'm going to kill you or throw you in jail. And are there different standards that you think should apply? I mean, I think we all agree there are different standards that should apply for the openness of discussion and the people's ability to decide who they disagree with when it comes to these, firing someone or disinviting them from your party, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the reason I lump those things together is because I'm a historian, so my focus is mostly on the 14th century, which is and I'm looking at human nature and this tendency that we just have to think that we have to have certain ideas, we have to enforce them on everybody. A dominant group gets to decide what those are, and anybody who differs that should be killed, persecuted, punished, or whatever. For example, in my period, there were no admitted Jewish people in the UK because they would be killed. So this is where we've got this, I think, this innate ability, and what is new and what is special about the rising liberalism in weird cultures, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, is this idea that we don't have to do any of that, that we can actually coexist. And that does come down on this level to not firing people, not punishing people. When it comes to social things, I can certainly think that you're an asshole and not want to speak to you. And I can be very critical of you, and you can become a subject of contempt quite broadly if you're holding really horrible views and expressing them publicly. But we shouldn't try to punish people. I don't know often where the limit is. So, for example, if a janitor at a Jewish school was regularly tweeting that we need a second Holocaust, I think few people would blame the school for firing him, for thinking he could actually be a danger to the children. But if someone is expressing mainstream conservative views or social justice views, even in their own space, and they work in the post office or a library, they shouldn't be fired. It's trying to have an understanding that there isn't a black and white, there isn't a bright line here.
That what you said about not a black and white and a bright line, it reminds me of something that Robert said to me the other day, and I want to invite you to jump in on something here about how there's when you're writing about the John Stuart Mill and what he did for free speech, a lot of what he is talking about is about this idea of the culture of free speech. Actually, now your piece prompted me to go, and I was going to say to reread John Stuart Mill, but if I'm honest, it was to read him through all the way through for the first time, because I read bits and pieces and parts of On Liberty. This is the first time I sat down and said, okay, I read it from the beginning to the end. And I was struck by the extent to which he starts by basically saying, I'm not even going to talk about the political aspect of free speech. I'm not even going to talk about censorship. That's a situation that's already solved. And he has a little footnote about how, okay, well, there was this court case where these people were prosecuted, but that's an exception to the rule. And so he says, politically, legally, free speech is already established. I want to talk about why we should tolerate a diversity of opinions, the sort of thing that Helen was just saying. But you talk about how he sort of ends up sort of conflating the political and the cultural aspects, and that ends up sort of getting rid of the shades of gray and the judgment calls that people are making. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah. And John Stuart Mill is quite a fascinating character in that respect, because you can read him through and think he's really just doing a couple of different things. One common way to interpret him has been just to read him as a straight classical liberal who's just giving some really enthusiastic and kind of elevating arguments for what is a traditional classical liberal idea of, particularly free speech, of course, is his main consideration. But if you read very carefully, and actually he starts out by saying, I'm not going to talk about political freedom. And yet in his chapter on applications, that's all he talks about. So he seems to have this philosophical, conceptual program that he then, in his own way of bringing it to the public, actually, and I tend to not like John Stuart Mill, so maybe I'll use a slightly slanted simile, but it's like he's sweeping under the rug his actual intention, which is to conflate exactly what Helen was talking about with the political or legal concept of freedom of speech. And I think that's where the huge problem opens up, because in the old classical liberal idea, there was this bright line distinction between the legal and the moral or ethical. And on the legal side, you could be allowed to, you had every right to be a bigot, a transphobic, homophobic, whatever phobic you want, and whatever nasty, vicious sort of bigotry in your own private life, and to espouse whatever vicious ideas you wanted, as long as you didn't initiate force against other people or coerce them. And then we have this other concept, which is the moral concept. Yes, and of course the old line that's attributed to Voltaire, probably inaccurately, I despise what you say in various forms. I despise what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. And that is to draw the sharp line between the political and the ethical. I may despise your concepts, your ideas, but I would defend legally your right to espouse them. And where I think a lot of the problem comes in is when you try to equate having a despicable idea with coercion, and that moral disapproval with coercion. So I think, for example, in the ethical realm, you can have all sorts of gray areas and contexts and nuances that the legal or political sphere just doesn't admit of. So if I don't like a certain joke, for example, or if I don't want somebody to call me a foreigner here in China where I live today, I can tell them, that word rubs me the wrong way. But you can't really handle that the same way in a legal context. In adult conversation, we can handle, as mature adults, we can handle some disagreements and even something that's a little offensive to me. I can tell you, you can back off, or if you don't get the rules, then I'm not going to be talking to you anymore, maybe, or maybe I'll disinvite you from my supper club, or in the extreme case, you might be in a position to be fired for it. But I think once you get that blurred line that Mill introduced, once the personal is political, for that old catchphrase, then that liberalism in our personal lives tends to go away. The nuance doesn't really survive it. It tends to get squashed flat, and contexts become irrelevant.
Right. Well, specifically, what struck me about this is that Mill has this concept of moral coercion or social coercion, where other people's disapproval of yours is the equivalent of coercion, and that seems like a protection. And in some, in one version, it's a protection for the lone individual against social consensus. But on the other hand, it can then be used as a weapon by somebody saying, to silence other people, by saying, well, your opinion of me, your bad opinion of me is coercion against me. And you get this idea that, silence is violence, or sorry, not silence is violence, but speech is violence, that somebody else's disapproving speech, if you're transphobic and you say something, that is a violent act towards the people who are transgendered. So it's turned by making this a concept of social coercion, it can be turned around to be used as a weapon against of conformity.
Well, and in my symposium article, I actually argue that it not only can, but in a sense it must, because once you define that as tantamount to coercion, then in fact, just as the government can't say that we've proven someone is a murderer or has committed a violent crime, and then we just choose to let him go because he's a friend of the president or whatever. So if that becomes defined as coercion or tantamount to coercion, then it really becomes incumbent on us, on the woke or whatever the equivalent is on the right, then to go out and punish that person, again, by equivalent means. So deplatforming and cancel culture and all the rest of it, I think actually spins right out of that concept, which, as you say, initially in Mill's concept, and I think in Mill's own mind, was intended as a protection for robust, he called it at one point manly speech, but generally an open culture of clashing ideas that fits what you're calling the culture of free speech. Okay. So it actually, that concept actually ends up just undermining the very protection that it's intended to establish.
So this brings us back to some of the, did somebody have something they wanted to inject?
Kathy.
I heard a sigh that sounded like an interesting thought in the making.
Okay.
Oh, well, yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it's interesting that, especially if we apply this to today's debates on free speech and so-called cancel culture, really the Millian position can be found all across the spectrum. And it's really sort of, you know, million versus million, so to speak, because, you know, at one end, we have people saying, for instance, that, you know, the sort of social contempt that is expressed toward, for instance, transgender people or toward racial minorities, it really amounts to making them physically unsafe, which is sort of the favorite expression, you know, so that, you know, for instance, in one controversy that I saw just yesterday on Twitter, apparently there is some transgender activists in Canada who have been complaining that the presence of a book by Abigail Schreier, which is critical of certain aspects of the transgender movement, is essentially making the library unsafe for them. And then conversely, at the other end, we have people saying that this sort of intense social disapproval of speech that's considered racist, transphobic, or you know, otherwise contrary to norms of social equality is suppressing their right to free speech. So it's sort of a conundrum. And, you know, I guess ultimately the question is, you know, which of these 2 million sides do we consider to be correct? I mean, are they both wrong? I mean, is it really just free speech all the way? And I think there are some interesting aspects there, but I'll get back to that later and cede the floor to Helen.
Go ahead.
My point was, I was going to bring up, I don't know if you've read Ian Dunt's latest on liberalism, where he divides in a way that makes intuitive sense to me, egalitarian liberalism, which is Millian, and my kind of liberalism, from classical liberalism, which is Adam Smith, and much more to markets and that kind of thing. But I think it goes beyond social disapproval. I think people can and should be expected to deal with social disapproval. I think that obviously if somebody is receiving a great deal of abuse, as my uncle did, he actually left the country because he's gay, then we need to try and change the culture that causes that. But people can deal with social disapproval. What we're looking at the moment with cancel culture is not, it goes much deeper than that. It's not about the state, the law, but it is about social pressure. So I hear from a lot of small businesses who want to find a way to stay afloat without going woke. So particularly within the arts, we're hearing from people who say, I want to feature work from artists with a variety of views, but if I do, everyone else in the industry will be afraid to do business with me. I will be, you know, I'm expected to make statements condemning various writers or artists. If I don't, I'm going to be blacklisted. My business can't survive. How do I negotiate this? And this is something that's that's most commonly being called woke capitalism at the moment. And I think there's a lot to that I'm going to do a lot more research into. So social disapproval, yeah, if somebody wants to hate me because I'm white, a woman, or because I have these political views, I'll survive that. There are enough people who will support me. But if somebody wants to make it impossible for me to actually do my job, run my business, unless I comply with their views, I think we have a problem in culture that we need to really focus on actually changing that culture so that it doesn't incentivize this kind of behavior.
Yeah, I just want to express total agreement with Helen here. And I think that that really is the dividing line when we're talking about which side of this, million debate is the actual free speech suppression or just speech suppression period, is it on? And I do think that there's a difference between, even if we're talking about social pressure in both cases, I think there's a difference between a situation in which you sort of feel discomfort, or you feel some sort of internal stress, anxiety, because people are not supportive of your identity and your way of life on the one hand, and a situation in which you're actually in danger of losing your job or losing your business if you express disapproved of points of view, or even if you fail to, as Helen was pointing out, because to me, I think that's where we're really getting into dangerous territory, because this is where we're getting into the sort of classical distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism, which is generally regarded as considerably worse, where if we're talking about the political level in an authoritarian system, you're generally forbidden, or you can face very unpleasant consequences if you if you express a forbidden viewpoment. But other than that, you're really pretty much left alone. Whereas in totalitarian systems, classically, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany being sort of two obvious examples, you are expected to actually actively profess loyalty to the regime not just once or twice, but on a regular basis. You're expected to participate in certain social rituals where you essentially make statements of loyalty. And obviously, again, in this case, in the sort of woke culture that we're seeing today, there's no political demands to that effect. Nobody's gonna throw you in prison for not putting up a Black Lives Matter sign on your lawn, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I think we are witnessing those situations where people and businesses really do feel that they need to make those various solidarity statements to sort of stay employed or stay in business.
Yeah, well, what Helen was talking about with the woke businesses worrying about, what if I don't say the right thing and I don't put Black Lives Matter placard or whatever the latest loyalty test is. It reminded me a lot of Václav Havel writing in The Power of the Powerless. It's about, he starts with this thing about you put the grocer has a placard that says "Workers of the World Unite" in the front window. And he says, it's not that he has great convictions about the workers of the world and why they should unite. He does that because he knows he'll get in trouble if he doesn't. And, he's basically, the actual message is, I am afraid and want to be left alone. And I think that, so the fact that, but I want to talk about the fact that we have you can have a John Stuart Mill sort of approach on either side and have these counter claims between them, kind of indicates to me you need some other principle to sort of be the underpinning of this idea of a culture of free speech. It is free speech or open debate as a cultural norm. You need some other principle. And I think one of the things that strikes me is that you were talking about the differentiation between authoritarian and totalitarian, and there's a sort of a feel to that because I guess the rule, in my view, in a liberal society, the rule should be much more that, okay, there's a couple of viewpoints over here that we regard as beyond the pale. And if you're, a Holocaust denier, right, you will be ejected from polite society. But there's like this small handful of things like that. There are other crackpot views that we regard as completely irrational but harmless, like, you believe NASA faked the moon landing. Well, that's totally irrational, but we consider that harmless, so we're not going to bother with you. But there's this very small amount of things you could say, you can't say that, or you'll be ejected. But then the field, the rest of the field is open, that the rule should be, you can say what you want and have a vigorous debate and go back and forth. And culture, not just politically, but culturally, that will be tolerated because we think it's a value to have that debate. Even if we don't agree with you, we think it's a value to have the debate. Whereas the things that are totally off limits culturally as cultural norms should be very, very limited. Now, personally, I have a long complaint that, we justifiably have, Holocaust denial and supporting the Nazis will get you in big trouble. But being a communist won't, even though, that almost as many people died, or probably more people died from communism than from Nazism. But again, you have to make that, it should be difficult. It should be a difficult and arduous thing to make that kind of what you call moral quarantine, where there's an idea so bad, so horrible and destructive that it's considered sort of culturally off limits to do it. It should be really difficult. It should be an exception. But let's sort of throw around, I want everybody to weigh in on what do you think should sort of be your sense of the rule or dividing line for this sort of cultural norm of what's tolerated versus not tolerated?
I'm a liberal humanist, so I'm always going to argue for a plurality of ideas and for liberal humanist ideas. So I can only argue from my own position, where I would never say that any view cannot be discussed, but I would be hopeful that it would be we could have it regarded with such contempt that the people who do raise these ideas are really recognized as deranged extremists who have no social prestige. I don't think we can draw a line. Obviously, Nazis, if someone wants to deny the Holocaust or even, say that it was a good thing, they should be recognized by society as a really terrible human being who you probably don't want to be friends with. But I don't know where you would draw the line of saying, what was their job? If they were a lighthouse keeper, should they be fired? They're not going to bother anybody with these horrible ideas, but you may not want to, in a lot of places, an employer, for example, would be quite right to say, I'm not going to employ someone who wants Jewish people dead. So I'm afraid I just think the situation is trying to set out first principles is something we can do, but generally when it comes down to a situation, we have to take that situation. So we had a situation here where a black vicar said that the cult of Captain Tom, the 100-year-old man who raised a lot of money for NHS charities and then died of COVID, was white nationalism. And he was a vicar and the church is investigating him. There was a petition for him to be fired. This is, I think, this situation is going to an extreme. If the church believed that was an unchristian attitude, they should talk to him about that. But this whole thing where he should be fired for having said this is the culture that we need to work again. I'm afraid I'll not be much use in drawing lines in these kind of things. I think we have to take each situation as it is.
Yeah, I totally agree with Helen. And, I think I like what Bob said about sort of minimizing the number of these, ideas that we kind of officially considered, well, not really officially in the sense of government or involvement, but just sort of a social consensus that certain things are beyond the pale. I think if we're going to say, well, there are certain lines that you cannot cross, and in terms of the ideas you articulate, and sort of remain within, polite society, whatever that is these days. I think these lines should be drawn really as narrowly and as carefully as possible in terms of whether we can articulate any sort of principle that underlines where to draw these lines. I would say, obviously, anything that amounts to the advocacy of violent suppression of certain people because of, who they are. Like if you advocate, for instance, that women should have no role in society except to be housewives and sex slaves, and that there should be the women should have no property rights and no voting rights, etc. And I think that's a viewpoint that I really would have no trouble excluding from mainstream dialogue. If you hold the opinion that slavery was actually pretty good, and that really should be like the system that we should be aspiring to return to, I have no problem. Partly it's not even just that those views are repugnant, although they are. It's just, how much of our mental energy really do we want to spend relitigating issues that were settled, thankfully, over 100 years ago? And, do we really want to sort of pointlessly debate something just for the sake of debating it and sort of checking off the, yeah, we debated this, fine, we allowed the opposite point of view. Obviously there are, to some extent, our mental space is limited in terms of, how many different viewpoints can we accommodate on a given issue. And I think there's really no point in sort of allocating headspace to advocacies of, slavery, female subjugation, or let's say, the not even necessarily the extermination of Jews, but let's say depriving Jews of civil rights. There's really just no point in it. On the other hand, I think, we get into really complicated issues if, for instance, we're talking about not the violent suppression of women, for instance, but sort of distinct gender roles. And, if someone is not advocating stripping women of their rights, but is basically saying, well, I think women, generally speaking, would be a lot happier if they were housewives and, did not get into these ambitious careers and so on. Should they face some kind of social sanction for saying that? And I would say no, even though I very strongly disagree with that viewpoint. But, I do think that as a woman, you should be able to cope with someone having a viewpoint that you find offensive. You're perfectly free to find it offensive and to tell them that they find it offensive. So I think that if we're talking about the kind of social pressure where somebody can, effectively feel silenced in expressing that point of view and cannot express it without jeopardizing their job, yeah, that's bad. And that's, again, it's difficult because I think there is a certain, turning point or a certain threshold beyond which, the viewpoint that women shouldn't have careers can also become a form of social coercion, even if there's no sort of legal coercion. But so it's tricky. It's tricky.
I think what we're getting into is that cancel culture is a little bit like pornography. You know it when you see it. But Bob, tell me about what you think about this.
Yeah, there's and just on Kathy's point, there's the simpler issue, I think clearer issue, like the Larry Summers apostasy of making the claim that women may not be on average as skilled at mathematical fields as men are, which is at least something that should be debatable.
Of course.
At least it should be something that where there is empirical research possible. And I doubt that it's intrinsically a major difference if there is a difference, but it's something that should be debatable.
Of course.
But now, getting back to the initial question, I think there's a certain problem in the framing of the question. You asked, what is the line?
Right.
And I don't think there is the line. I think that's exactly my point about ethical issues having context and nuance built into them, where in the law, we need to squeeze context out as much as humanly possible. There should be as thin a penumbra of uncertainty around any legal action as possible. But in ethical, moral considerations, it's all about the context. So for example, will I be your friend if you believe in creationism? Possibly. Will I want you to be teaching my child biology? Probably not. So it's going to depend heavily on that context and what is the purpose of this interaction. And that's where law really is a ham-fisted beast. And I think that's the point that I keep hammering in my writing on Mill, is that by blurring those lines, by introducing this concept that social pressuring can be tantamount to legal coercion, Mill actually ends up squeezing all that nuance out rather than actually protecting the real freedom, the social freedom to have disagreements and debates and disputes and so on. So I think that whole idea comes from legalistic thinking. What is the line? The Supreme Court needs to hand down a dividing line, a test, or even if it's a balancing test, it should be a clear balancing test that applies or doesn't apply. But I don't have that in my dealings with you.
All right. So against all you Mandy Pamby people who don't want to draw a strict line, I actually have a proposed line.
No, I have a line, and I think it was where Kathy's is. I think that hard and fast line in law is the incitement of violence, whereas the social thing, that's the Overton window that we're talking about at the moment. The idea that women shouldn't have rights or any social power is outside it. The idea that women are happier in domestic roles is still inside it, and I would like to argue with it and contribute to pushing it outside it. But that's a social thing. So that isn't a line. That's a shifting gauge, and we can work on how we shift it.
Well, here's my view, and I'm going to take a cue from Robert here, who talked about the Supreme Court handing down tests, and I think the test should be the reasonable man test. Now, you'll see I'm cheating here because the reasonable man test is also famous for not being such a hard and fast dividing line. But if you look at sort of if I'm look at what sort of unites Mill and Locke in their defenses of free speech, is that they both make, at least for a large part of what they say, they both make an epistemological argument. The idea is that you need to have free speech so that people can engage in reasoning. We have free speech in order to debate, in order to protect the process of human reasoning. And the only way to arrive at rational conclusion, at proper conclusions and proper convictions about religion, Locke says, is to the inward light of reason, to be convinced by argument rather than outward force. That's this classical liberal conception. The Millian conception is he spends a lot of time, I think the best passages of On Liberty are where he talks about the role that, I think that's where he comes up with the line about how he who knows only his own side of an argument knows little of that. And the importance of debate and open discussion to being able to understand ideas and to know whether your view is right or whether it's wrong. And so I think that the criterion I would set up is not just, I agree with the one about sort of borderline incitement. I mean, actual incitement is a legal definition and it may be different in different areas, but the sort of borderline saying, okay, we're going to use violence against somebody. I would also add that, what I think defines cancel culture is an argument that's in the form of shut up, he explained, right? So where you are considered, outside of the realm of discussion simply by being who you are, simply by having your position, and no counter argument needs to be made. You are just anathema. And so I think the idea is that, you should have, the dividing line is, do you have an argument, a rational argument to make? Are you bringing a position that is rationally debatable? Like, can you go to statistics about how people have women have aptitudes about mathematics, or you have statistics you can go to. You can have a reasonable argument that can be made. Now, I also think that we have, like what Kathy said about how there are certain issues, and there should be very few of them, but they're there, where we say, okay, we've had that debate. We had an open debate, we've settled it, and your position is considered irreparably discredited. And I do think now what will happen over time is sometimes something that was irreparably discredited 100 years ago, because those arguments have faded, because we stopped having those arguments, it will come back again in some new form, and they found some way to adapt. So it's always going to be a battle. I think this is a point that Bob made to me a while back, which is this is in some way this has always been going on. We think of it as being worse now than it has ever been, but there's always a culture war. There's always speech that's considered beyond the pale, and I think as Helen was saying, it's more the norm in human history to have considered to be that there's very strict controls.
And I think that's an important point because because it came from me originally, but the reason it really does matter is because I think we can sometimes get wrapped around our own axle complaining about our current age. And we do have to maintain a certain perspective to say that it's not that this is unprecedented in all of human history. It's not that the world is doomed or on a death spiral, because if you look at it's been pointed out by smarter people than me that the press at the time of America's founding was anything but objective, neutral, and full of warm-hearted discussion. So we can sometimes get a little too apocalyptic in our own thinking, which then just feeds right into that sort of cancel culture. If the world is ending tomorrow because of this, then we better really ramp up the fire and brimstone. So I do think there's a certain cooling that needs to take place.
Yeah, somebody asked earlier, what's the conservative equivalent of woke? And the conservative equivalent of woke is MAGA, Make America Great Again. And I think this is how you get the things like these bills being passed to say, oh, social media companies, we're going to control who social media companies can block, how they can do moderation. We're going to, ban certain things from being taught in classrooms. Where if you think that, if you have this apocalyptic mindset, you say, well, the other side's using coercion and social pressure to impose their view. So we're going to use, we don't want to be unilaterally disarmed. We're going to use coercion and social pressure to impose our views, rather than, let a thousand, let a thousand flowers bloom. Is that the saying?
I think that's Mao's line.
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking, wait a minute, that was Mao. Maybe not the best quote to use, but there is that.
But it's still a good thought, I suppose, Yeah.
Well, it was his way of getting the flowers to raise their heads up.
Right,
so right. Chop them down.
Yeah.
I think when I think about this and the current polarization that we have at the moment, I think back to after the Reformation and the creation of the Book of Common Prayer, because there was so much polarization between Catholics and Protestants. And it went back, and the average person just became so sick of it. And it was, you know, that there were these extremists on both sides, and that we've seen that wonderful image with the extremists accusing each other of things and everyone in the middle going, oh, shut up. And I think that's quite a lot of what we're seeing now. And then the Book of Common Prayer was produced, which was written in a way that both Catholics and Protestants could say the creeds without going against their own core values. And this was what was done. And this is what I keep hoping is going to happen with our current situation, that the average person is going to get so sick of the polarization that we're going to see an increasing pressure to just regard the extremists as lunatics and to push them out. I mean, this is how America founded. We got so fed up with the Puritans that we essentially kicked them out, and they ended up over there. So, you know, something like that, except I don't know where we'd send them. That the moon was suggested, but you know,
it's Virgin Islands. And then
there
it's way up above Canada. It's not a promising place. Go ahead.
There have been some interesting, you know, I happen to live in China at the moment, and one reason I came to China was because an accident of history. At the time that I came to this country, China seemed to be on a trajectory toward opening up and more discussion, which did not prove to be a historically prescient move on my part. But what's interesting to me is that in this country, at certain brief periods in their history, the Chinese have had some really interesting and exciting debates because they didn't have that tradition of the polarization. And in fact, they had a deliberately kind of, I'm fumbling for a word, but well, no, not, in fact, the idea was kind of mixing various viewpoints in one's own practice. So you would go to the Taoist temple on their holidays, and you'd go to the Confucius temple on other days, and you could even throw in Christianity. And there was this sort of idea, not that it wasn't throughout history, but that these could coexist in one mind even, let alone in one society. And unfortunately, what we've seen is, again, going back to my point that historically these have been brief moments. There was a moment like that in the early 20th century when there was this incredible foment in China, and then the Japanese invaded and all of that just went away. And then there was starting to be that same sort of thing in the reform and opening up days, but then that just keeps getting quashed here. When I came to China, there was a degree of academic freedom that did not exist in American universities. So you could have those debates and discussions, and there was no fear of repercussion or any such thing. You could have debates about topics that in the US would get you fired instantly. As long as you didn't touch certain political topics, it was encouraged. Now that's all gone by the wayside once again, and it has to be Mao Zedong thought from
Xi Jinping thought.
Oh, interesting.
Now that brings up a question, which is that I want to end with this, also a lightning round on this, which is one of the reasons we talk about a culture of free speech is partly because I think it's valuable in and of itself, valuable to be able to be open and debate and discuss things, and it makes life much more interesting and richer and tends to lead us more towards the truth. But there's also the fact that the culture of free speech is viewed also as a defense for political free speech. That if we, have a regard for openness and debate as a cultural norm, we're going to be less inclined to want the government to come in and do that. So I want to have everybody sort of comment just very briefly on, and whereas your experience in China almost seems to go against that to some extent, that you had the opening up culturally and there's no political correctness in China. and yet there's also political controls coming down from the top on speech. So maybe a comment from everybody on, starting with Bob, to talk on what you see as a relationship between the culture of free speech as a safeguard or protection for political free speech.
The China case is a very different one because you had a change of regime. You know, Xi Jinping came in and changed the direction of the country. And so I think that you can't necessarily take that as a refutation of the overall point that I think is true. And China is a prime example of where the political quashes the cultural, but I think it goes both ways. And I do think that when we have that notion that the other side is not treating us fairly, you know, and I think objectively you could point to cases going back through the last 50 years or more where the mainstream media in the US was in fact biased against the right. So what's the reaction? Well, first you get Fox News that claims to be fair and balanced, but then pushes more and more toward what I regard as anything but. And then you end up with MAGA, as you say, that treats the press as the enemy of the people. So that idea of actual objectivity as a goal, whether or not it's been consistently implemented at any time in history, as that fundamental lodestar, that ideal that you're pursuing, I think does in fact take the pressure off the political. And when you don't have it, then the political spirals in very deadly ways. And I think that if anything good has come from the Trump years, it's this kind of conversation where I think starting with the never Trump right, and then expanding to at least certain elements of the never Trump right, and then expanding to some of the sympathetic views on the center left, we now are having this conversation because all of a sudden we can see that there were people on the other side of the aisle who weren't whatever vicious troglodytes I had been raised to think they were. And there were people on my side of the aisle who in fact were the vicious troglodytes that the other guys were claiming all along. And I'd been spending my whole life saying, no, that's a caricature. Well, maybe it wasn't such a caricature. And so I think now there is becoming a new sort of, there is beginning a new impetus toward this kind of across the aisle dialogue between people who in good faith hold different views on issues of free speech and on of other political issues that I think could actually lead to a new flowering of discussion in America and beyond.
1,000 flowers really will bloom. One last word from Helen and Kathy.
I mean, I would say I always point out I'm not qualified to talk on legislation. I look at culture, I look at ideology, I look at discourses and ways of talking about things. My aim is to influence culture in such a way that enough people want to elect someone who will defend their freedom of speech and their freedom. The freedom to exchange ideas is what I think is key here, because that freedom of exchange of ideas can only take place if other people want to exchange those ideas with you. So that doesn't then include everything like, was the moon landing faked? Majority of people aren't going to want to get into those conversations, but the conversations that people want to have. So we're finding here in the UK, at the moment, I'm really quite frustrated as a lifelong Labour voter that we just cannot get a liberal freedom of speech, consistent principles going that will also support the economic policies that I favour. But on the plus side, I'm seeing for the first time among the Tories, among our Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, and others, some really properly liberal ideas where we're not cancelling any kind of ideas. We're not going to cancel critical race theory from schools, but it can't be taught without counter views and that kind of thing. And I think this is something that gives me hope. I'm still not going to support the Tories for various economic reasons, but that, yes, this is actually one of the good points that has come from elements on the left going so wrong, is that elements on the right have become more liberal in order to respond. I think all that we can do, if we are focusing on culture, if we want to influence politicians, is that we have to remember that they essentially want to get elected, which means that they want to impress the greatest number of people. For my part, as someone who deals with culture, the only thing I can do is try to get more people on the liberal left and the liberal right to want freedom of expression, and make that something that that politicians, a need that politicians want to serve if they want power.
Kathy.
Okay. So I think as far as the sort of intersection, to use a fashionable word, of political and cultural freedom of speech, there's an interesting argument that was made some months ago by Reason Magazine's Elizabeth Nolan Brown, sort of in the context of all these debates about whether the government should intervene to stop or curb a supposedly unfair enforcement of speech regulations by the social media giants like Facebook and Twitter, and whether we should actually sort of require these giant companies that serve as a kind of public square to essentially abide by First Amendment rules of speech. And then Nolan Brown was pointing out, and I think it's an interesting point, that if you actually remove the ability of private platforms to regulate speech by participants somewhat, and if you, for instance, say that, okay, if you use Twitter, you're sort of obligated to coexist with outspoken Nazis, Klan, KKK people, white supremacists, misogynists, etc. And like, even if they get verbally abusive, and even if they, say horrible things to people of other, identities, there's absolutely nothing that Twitter can do to moderate this, or Facebook. And Elizabeth's point was that this would actually create ultimately pressure for government to intervene to curb offensive speech. Because if people have no way of escaping it in the places where they sort of commonly socialize, they're going to get really fed up with it, and they're going to say, well, I really don't want to have to tolerate this. So that, in effect, the ability of private actors to quote unquote censor speech to some extent really protects us from government censorship. And I agree with that. I think that's a really good point. I think that there is a place for a sort of social consensus on a lot of these issues. On the other hand, and this is where I get into this conundrum of, the sort of million conundrum of, is there a line? And if so, where should it be drawn? I do think that there is a certain point past which, speech regulation and sort of speech policing, so to speak, by private entities, especially ones that have a huge amount of cultural power like Twitter or even Facebook, to some extent, where really, like, these days, if you're a journalist, for instance, it's extremely difficult to practice your profession without being on Twitter. I mean, I've actually run into employers in the media saying that you're required to have a Twitter account and to be active on Twitter in order to promote the product, because that's, that's where the action is, so to speak. So, past a certain point, if we have Twitter, for instance, saying that you're not allowed to question whether, and to take just one policy that actually is a sort of Twitter policy, you're not allowed to question whether transgender women are women. And I think that's those kind of norms, when enforced by Twitter, can also create a significant limitation on allowable debate, including on issues that I would say are really not settled issues. And I think that's something to be concerned about. And again, I don't have a solution. I think that, I would say, I would just sort of throw one real quick thought out there on the subject of what Bob was saying before, that essentially this assumption that social disapproval equals coercion really creates the impetus for a lot of these sort of repressive attitudes toward politically incorrect speech, when, for example, we have transgender activists saying that not validating their identities as a form of violence. I would say that this is where there's a big difference to me between social disapproval in the sense of someone sort of registering their non-support for your, let's say, way of life or your identity, and someone either berating you or really trying to ostracize you, trying to deprive you of a livelihood, because it seems to me that there's a big difference between someone saying, yeah, I don't really believe that transgender women should be considered women in like every sense of the word. So there's that, and I guess you could say that that's coercive, although I don't really see how but there's a big difference between someone saying that or someone saying, I think that transgender women or transgender people are so morally offensive that we really shouldn't even have them in this space. Like you should, or they shouldn't be able to work here if they have openly declared their transgender identity. So I think there's, again, it's a lot of this is about definitions, and I think we're also we don't have a single definition of what constitutes social disapproval. Is it merely the failure to validate someone, or is it actually, hounding somebody out of a job? I think there's a big difference.
Well, here's where I kind of want to go back to the reasonable man standard, which is, I think you need some degree of moderation and keeping throwing out the loud drunks, so to speak, at the cocktail party. You need that on Twitter and you need that on Facebook to help create a space for discussion. But if they don't do it, if it isn't done in a reasonable way, it creates a pressure for government to come in and do it. And then I think we can expect government's going to do an even worse job than Twitter and Facebook, if that's possible. So at any rate, I think this has been a great conversation. I think we've gotten a better understanding of these issues and the different outlooks on this. I really want to thank all of you for participating. We've had Helen Pluckrose from Counterweight. We have Kathy Young from Arc Digital, and Bob Garmong, who's a contributor to Symposium. Thank you all for coming together for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable and informative.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Rob Trasinski with Symposium Magazine.
Subscribe to us on YouTube or subscribe to the podcast. And above all, you can read the contributions of these authors at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.